I wanted to tell you that we're a worldwide not-for-profit. We're dedicated to helping people gain knowledge about forgiveness and to use that knowledge to gain help for themselves as well as groups and society. We're actually observing our 30th anniversary right now. And we count, as one of our colleagues, my longtime friend Desmond Tutu, he said at one of our first conferences, "Without forgiveness, there is no future." And we think that's really true. And Desmond signed up our IFI perspectives in an essay he wrote, where he said, "Forgiveness gives us the capacity to make a new start. We are declaring our faith in the future." And in other words, we don't have to allow harm that we've received to continue to rent space in our minds and our hearts. So we believe that forgiveness is a choice. If you've been deeply hurt by someone else, you can choose to forgive rather than to hold on to debilitating anger and resentment. And we think an amazing transformation takes place. The clouds of anxiety and depression start to give way to enhanced self-esteem and genuine feelings of hopefulness. I think when we forgive, we benefit ourselves and others. So we liberate ourselves from the pain and sorrow, and we can reclaim our lives. So we're convinced that anyone, individuals, families, communities, governments, can experience that extraordinary benefit of forgiveness. By learning to forgive and committing to live the forgiving life, we think we can restore healthy emotions, rebuild relationships, and establish more peaceful communities. So I think that fits in very well with your mantra. We believe that we have a forgiving instinct embedded in us. So I think we say that all of us, I think we have a merciful heart, and we have the power within ourselves, each of us, to free ourselves and to live a better life. So I think empathy resides in us. Forgiveness, I say, is based on that innate capacity. It's a moral choice, as I said. It's a call to our heart, and forgiveness as a choice. It's a gift, but I think, first of all, is that we give to ourselves. So Bob is the expert here, and he'll give you the important insights into the power of forgiveness. But to be clear, this isn't some quick process. Things take time. So we hope that this is going to be a conversation rather than just presentations and you listen and that's all you do. We think that every one of us in this world has either had to forgive someone else or needed to be forgiven ourselves. So I'd like to make sure that this time, as does Bob, that this is a personally rewarding time for you. So I'll pass it off to someone who can give you the best and most coherent insights into forgiveness.
Thank you very much, Roy, and thank you, Zen Peacemakers, for putting up with us for an hour and a half. We appreciate your being here. And what I'd like to do for the next little while is first talk with you about woundedness and then the definition of forgiveness. Because forgiveness actually centers in woundedness. It's about trying to pick ourselves up out of the pit to which someone might have thrown us, and even to try and pick up that other person who has done the throwing. And so it deals with a woundedness that you and I share because we've all been wounded at one time or another by others. And here's the real difficulty. I've been studying forgiveness now for over 3 decades, and I've come to this insight. It's not the injustices against us that are the most hurtful. It's the effects of what happens to us after we've been treated unjustly by others. You see, when we're treated unjustly by others, it's either a snapshot in time where it has happened once, or it's a series of snapshots that have happened if someone is continually hurting us. But it happens in time, and eventually most of the injustices we experience toward us come to an end. Unfortunately, what I have found is once the injustice takes root in the human heart, the effects become very uncivil within us. They become very rude in that they take off their stinky shoes, set up house within our hearts, and then they don't know how to leave. For example, we've worked with women in hospice situations. They were all in their 80s, and some of them were carrying the wounds or the effects of injustice in their heart for over 40 years. Think about that. They have been wounded by others at a point in time way back, yet the effects live on. And many of them were going to take this woundedness to their grave until they learn to forgive. And in fact, there is a study done of 24 research articles by a group. The first author is Vidal-Ribas, Vidal-Ribas. And they looked at 24 different studies of youth, adolescents, who have been treated deeply unfairly by others and have developed what we call resentment. Other synonyms for that are toxic anger, or psychiatrists, those with a medical degree who go into the mental health profession, call resentment, or what they call it actually irritability. And here's what Vidal-Ribas and others have concluded in looking across 24 studies of youth who first had a situation that led to the effects of irritability or deep excessive anger. And I quote, "We found that irritability, that's that effect in the heart, forms a distinct dimension with a substantial stability across time, and that it is specifically associated with depression and anxiety in longitudinal studies into adulthood." In other words, something that might have happened to you at age 16 could be still living with you now. And the problem with that is, we find, when we have this kind of discontent in our heart, again, it's such an uncivil thing. It doesn't know enough to stay within. It can flow out to others as what we call displacement, where you get the whole dump truck dumped upon you because someone else was angry with someone else, perhaps in their family of origin. It can lead to discouragement. As Roy Lloyd said in his introduction, it can lead to anxiety and depression, as Vidal-Ribas and others have found. And it can lead to a breakdown in trust for many of your other relationships. For example, if someone is hurt in a family situation when they're 6 years old, they might be very hesitant to form their own family because they realize that the effects in their heart are toxic, and it kind of creates a barrier for them. And that's why we're here today. We're here today to talk with you about being freed from these effects that literally could last for the rest of your life. And the only cure for this kind of resentment or toxic anger or irritability that I have ever found that has been particularly effective for curing that is forgiveness. All right? There are all kinds of psychotherapies. For example, there's cognitive behavior therapy, pioneered by Aaron Beck, But you know what Aaron Beck said about that, which is the most popular psychotherapy on the planet right now, cognitive behavioral therapy? He said it can only go so far. He said when people are living with this kind of resentment, my, meaning his, cognitive behavior therapy can't really cure that. But he said forgiveness, even he says that as a giant in the field, humbly says forgiveness itself that he hasn't studied could be a cure for the kind of resentment that not even the best psychotherapies on the planet may be able to cure and don't. And so if that's the case, then what is forgiveness? I admire the ancient Greeks, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, because so many of Plato's dialogues started with the question, what is it? And so we have to know what it is if we're going to spend some time together and perhaps appropriate that in our own hearts for good. The most simple definition I can give you, and I'm going to go more deeply in a moment than this, is this. Forgiveness is being good to those who are not good to you. How crazy is that? Be good to those who are not good to you? It sounds kind of silly, isn't it? Can't someone romp and stomp all over my face if I'm good to those who are not good to them? Well, yes, to a certain degree, because what's the scary part of forgiveness is that, well, we're giving up a quest for fairness. We're giving up a quest for justice as we deal with mercy. Mercy is giving more than a person deserves. Okay? And we actually see that in the ancient texts, whether it's Hebrew, Christian, Islamic, Buddhist, Hindu, Confucian, we see an honored place for forgiveness in all of these, actually. The oldest preserved account I have ever been able to read, ever making it into print and preserved, is Joseph forgiving his half-brothers in the Hebrew Bible. It's the first book, actually. Well, it's Genesis, the first book of the Bible, chapters 37 to 45. His half-brothers were really mean to him. They threw him down a well to murder him. They pulled him out and didn't really dust him off and change their mind and say, sorry, bro, let's let bygones be bygones here. They actually sold him into slavery in Egypt. That's a second blow to him. And he finally found favor with the king and became a governor. And at the time, the Hebrew nation was in a famine situation and they could have ceased to exist. So the 10 half-brothers went to Egypt to beg for food and animals and provisions. And they met the governor, who happened to be Joseph, and they didn't even know that because they thought he was a slave. And eventually, after he threw them in prison and played tricks on them, because forgiveness doesn't just happen overnight, it took a while for him, he finally, unconditionally, without them ever apologizing, because they didn't know he was Joseph, he embraced them, he wept over them, he gave them food and provisions, and he basically, through his forgiving, helped save the Hebrew nation. Right? Many people don't even realize that the Hebrew nation was made more whole because a forgiving act by Joseph as a governor in Egypt thousands of years ago. And we see similar stories in other texts. For example, there's a Buddhist story in 22 different versions of Buddhism that does not use the word forgiveness, but shows it. There is a philosopher who innocently visits the harem of the king to discuss philosophy. And the king, after waking up, accuses him of infidelity and cheating with the harem, and he has the philosopher beaten. And the king says, now how do you feel about life? And he says, I try not to get angry with those who abuse me. You see, he was being merciful towards someone who had a deep injustice against him, and yet he was rising above the effect. The king in this Buddhist story got so angry, he had him drawn and quartered and cut off his limbs. And when the philosopher was dying, the king said, "Now, how do you feel?" And he repeated, "I try not to get angry with those who abuse me." To his dying breath, he was being a teacher to the king. To his dying breath, he was being merciful to the king. Okay? If had he lived, which of course he couldn't under that circumstance, he in all likelihood would have had the effects of that, the toxic anger or irritability, melted away from his heart. Similar to Joseph, you see. And you see it in other stories, in other kind of religious and philosophical traditions of old. There's something about the human condition that values forgiveness. You and I could have a humanistic philosopher, a Jewish rabbi, a Christian pastor, an Islamic imam, a Buddhist believer, a Hindu believer, and a Confucian philosopher all sitting around a peace table. And we basically could agree, for the most part, we'd have some nuanced differences, but we could basically agree on what forgiveness actually is, regardless of culture, regardless of belief, because there seems to be something objective about forgiveness that cuts across all of these. And so here's the commonality that I see across all of the isms that sometimes get people to argue with one another. And it'd be so interesting if instead of arguing with one another, as the bombs continue in the Middle East, we would sit down together and say, you know, we share something in common. For example, did you know that the Joseph story in the Hebrew literature has a counterpart in the Islamic Quran? Did you know there's an entire book of the Quran called, you ready for this? Joseph. And it's the similar story, okay, where he helps save a nation. Don't you think they could both sit down at the peace table and talk about Joseph? I think so. But see, the world hasn't had the eyes to see yet the importance of forgiveness in the peace movement. And that's why I applaud you for being in the peace movement, because you could make a unique contribution to the world by bringing people together and talk about forgiveness that is part of their ancient heritage. And we could do that today if they let us into the Middle East. And what would we say at this peace table? What would we say forgiveness is? We would say 4 things about what forgiveness is, and the Islamic and Jewish people would agree with this, as would, in all likelihood, Buddhist, Christian, Confucian people, Hindu people, and humanistic people. 4 things. First, as Roy said, this is a moral virtue, forgiveness. Moral virtues always deal with goodness flowing out to others, like justice. Okay? Justice is considered a primary virtue. Plato wrote an entire book on it called The Republic. Okay? And basically what justice is giving others what they deserve. So if you're a carpenter and I need a table and we contract with that, once you build the table, I should give you money. I'm giving you what you deserve. That's justice, okay? Forgiveness is being good to those who aren't good to you. That's part of the moral virtue of it. But second of all, forgiveness is different from all the other virtues on the planet because it centers on goodness in the face of injustice. That's why it's such a heroic virtue. It is being good in the face of injustice. It's heroic. That's the second point. The third point upon which people would agree is when we forgive through our own free will, without being forced on it through other people, we try as best we can to get rid of the negatives, negative thoughts, feelings, and behaviors toward the one who hurt us. We try not to have condemning thoughts. We would try to transcend that, okay? We eventually, and we have to be patient with this, try to work on getting rid of hardness of heart or negative feelings that can start melting away when we do proper thinking. And we try to get rid of negative behavior. After all, remember what Gandhi said, everybody? If we keep taking an eye for an eye, the whole world will be blind. So part of this third point, when we're getting rid of negative thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, we don't take an eye for an eye. We deliberately choose not to do that. See, we get rid of three negatives. And the fourth and final point of what forgiveness is, and this is after a careful walk with forgiveness, practice on it, becoming more forgivingly fit. You don't just jump into this fourth point right away, you grow into it. You try to cultivate positive thoughts, feelings, and behaviors toward the one who hurt you. You try to see the humanity in the other. You try to have a softened heart and maybe try to help this other person overcome these bad habits. And you behave in such a way where you give a hand up to the person who threw you into the pit. And maybe they're in a pit from what has happened to them. And you say, come on up and join me, person to person. And so cultivating the positives is not something that fits into forgiveness right away for most people. We grow into it. And also there are 4 points I want to make about what forgiveness is not. That's one thing I learned from Aristotle, from ancient Greece. When you're defining a term, also be clear about what you're not discussing, okay? So here's 4 points, and this is our fourth point of what forgiveness is, and we're talking about now about what it isn't for the fourth point. It is not excusing what the other did. What the other did to you, if you have been treated unfairly by another person, is unfair. It was unfair when it happened, and it'll always be unfair. Your response of getting rid of the negative and offering the positive toward the other person does not invalidate the truth that what the person did was unfair. You don't forget, even though we use the term forgive and forget, I use the term you remember in new ways. So when you think about it, it doesn't have that welling up, the boiling up of the anger so much. So you remember in new ways, maybe with some sadness, maybe with some regret, but that irritability is reduced or wiped away. Third, and this point really gets forgiveness into trouble all the time, when you forgive, you might not reconcile with the other person. You see, reconciliation is not a moral virtue. It's a negotiation strategy in which two or more people come together again in mutual trust. You can forgive a person and watch your back. You can forgive a person and not reconcile. If you're in let's say, an employment situation where the boss is always coming down on you, you can forgive from the heart and walk away and find a new job. You don't have to stay there when you forgive and say, I've got to keep going back to all this abuse. Forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. See, that's a protection, because a lot of people say to me, Enright, you're telling me to forgive my romantic partner who isn't so romantic, where he could kill me because he's so abusive? What are you talking about? And my answer is no, I don't say that. You can forgive from the heart and then not reconcile. And then finally, our fourth point of what forgiveness is not, under the fourth point of what the definition of forgiveness, when we forgive, we do not throw justice under the bus. Forgiveness and the moral virtue of justice grow up together. Forgive and ask something of the other. Forgive and help the other work out the difficulties in the hope of reconciliation in many cases, but that might not occur. So when you forgive, you're not saying, okay, walk all over my face. That's what forgiveness is. I don't mind. That's a misunderstanding. When you forgive, Ask something of the other. Protect yourself. Remember what Roy said at the beginning? Yes, it's a moral virtue, but it's also a protection for oneself. And with that in mind, I think I've done what I can in this introductory part, and I'm going to hand it over to Roy to continue some more issues with you.
You're muted, Roy.
Sorry, I thought I was.
Well, you still are muted, Roy.
It's telling me I'm
There you go.
unmuted. Am I?
You're good now.
You're fine now.
All right, great. Thank you for that. I'd like you to think about something. What he's talking about is a change of perspective. Look at things in a different kind of way. And you know, all the story about how did the dinosaurs disappear when the climate changed? Well, we need to change the climate. We can be climate changers. We can be the ones who are active in making a difference, just as you're doing with the peacemakers. You're recalling and you're also calling people to get busy, I think. And I think it also gets to this point. There's a course that I teach at the university here in the communications department about the difference between hearing and listening. When we're hearing, we're spending most of our time trying to think up what we're going to say back. Listening means we stop and respectfully pay attention. And I think that's what Bob Enright is talking about. We pay attention to what we're saying to ourselves, and we try to understand the climate in which we're existing at this point. And I think the good thing is that we have all that we need within ourselves. We have the capacity innate in us, I believe. It's authentic. I think we are, I think we are maybe genetically programmed to be givers. And that's how as anthropologists keep showing us, that's how ancient civilizations got along. They cooperated. And that when they cooperated, revenge and things like that really were dissipated. So I think what we're talking about here is forgiveness as a way to repair our relationships with ourselves and with others. Do you want to add anything to that, Bob?
I think that summarizes it very well, Roy. I have nothing to add to that.
Okay, well, we want this to be a conversation, not just, you know, you're sitting here, you're going to take notes, whatever. We want you to have a chance to think about this yourself and to share with us. I mean, as I said at the beginning, each of us has had the opportunity and the need to be forgiven, as well as to offer forgiveness. So I wonder if any of you would like to give your reflection about what we've said so far and see how we can talk about this. Well, let me just, when there's someone to think about this. Some years ago, just to augment what Bob was saying about how this affects us personally, sometimes for years. Years ago, we got a major grant to study the effect of forgiveness on people who had heart attacks. Everyone got the same medical pharmacological treatment. One group had forgiveness studies added to the protocol. And guess what? people learn that things that they have been carrying within them for years had affected how they lived, and had detrimental effects on their lives. And those who had forgiveness studies added to them were much more likely to survive. I mean, statistically significant, if I'm correct about that, Bob. And also working with people in hospice. I've worked with hospice people. And what I've said to them is, how can you think about doing something like, I forgive you, will you forgive me? Can you say, I thank you, and I love you, and goodbye? That those are all part, I think, of the inevitable gift of forgiveness. So I see someone's up. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks so much for your presentation here. My reason for attending your presentation is I have a couple of sisters who are in a fight with each other right now. So I wonder if you have any suggestions for like how do you cultivate forgiveness in community with other people?
I think a very important first point is to gently talk about what forgiveness is, because in all likelihood, your sisters may be misunderstanding it, as so many people do. Like they might think it's excusing, or if they have to reconcile without working out their differences, they might think they can't ask for fairness. So I would start by just having a gentle conversation about forgiveness. And you could start with you. You could say, you know, the other day, so and so did this to me. And instead of just stewing about it, I started trying to forgive. And, you know, it really helped my inner world. And see if they brighten up or whether they yawn or whether they say, how dare you? And so you'll kind of gauge their readiness. And also, I would keep in mind that once they understand what forgiveness is, then give them a time to be drawn to it. Don't put pressure on them to forgive, okay? It's a free will decision and it's their choice. But eventually you could kind of plant a little seed, and here's what I would ask eventually after going through all what I just said. I would ask this at some point when you see they have good energy and they're in a pretty good mood. I would say, let's think about the future. We're all human and we're all going to die one day. I wonder what life will be like for us when we're elderly and we don't have that much longer to live. I wonder what life will be like in our hearts if we know then that we've done our best to create a good family climate, or whether we've ignored that. So you're not talking about now, you're talking about the distant future. And you're at least planting a seed of what their hearts might be like when their time is getting very, very short. And that can be a motivator where they might say, well, and this is typical. People say, well, you know, I'd like to forgive, but I don't know how. I face that regularly, okay? And so then you can go through a forgiveness process if you, which we're going to go through today, by the way, okay? So if you try to go through a process, you might be ready to be the forgiveness coach and get them to the scoring line so that they can practice it even a little bit, not even toward them each other, because if that's their hardest way to forgive, because they've built up this irritability, they can practice forgiveness on people who are easier to forgive, like a coworker, for example. Get them to know the pathway. And once they're drawn to it, then the punchline is, well, you know this, you seem to like it. How about if we try it, drum roll, please, within the family, and see we've kind of accompanied them to the point of being forgivingly fit with each other. And I think that would work. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I like the points that you made about having a certain amount of emotional distance and approaching them when they're in a good place. I'm also excited to hear about your ideas for being a coach.
Yeah, why not? Because if you know the pathway, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to help someone forgive. It seems to be, as Roy said, built into our humanity. And so try it and you can become a coach for them, and you could set the family free.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, this is Roy. And your good heart says a lot about your family. And I'm sure that we live in a time right now where, unfortunately, when people disagreeing with each other, they think they're enemies. And that's so disastrous. We just have different views of things. So I'm wondering if you were to ask your family members, you still love each other. Can you hear each other? Can you pay attention to each other? That's what I meant by listening rather than hearing. Because I'm sure what happens in those kinds of situations is you get into loud voices, and you don't get to any substantive issues. You're dealing with emotions, and if there's something specific, then maybe it can be uncovered in that way. What do you think, Bob?
Yeah, I think that sounds very good. The idea of a family that's bathed in love could be a big motivator for people, because if they see the time is passing and they're not taking advantage of that, okay, even if they say, well, the other doesn't deserve it, well, we all deserve love, and especially in a close family context like that, it could get their attention. Okay, and if not, well, maybe they need a little time. Their no today doesn't mean no in a month.
And this is Roy again. Um, I think that what helps to change things is a climate that encourages it. You are clearly giving a caring heart. And I think the way that the climate in which we exist does help to encourage a willingness to forgive. I think about the Amish people, for example. Culturally, religiously, they live in a pro-forgiveness environment. So they're, I would call super givers. Well, I mean, I think what Bob is suggesting is you help to create that caring, loving, forgiving climate. And that maybe encourages a willingness to pay attention to each other and say, maybe I misunderstood you, or I got it wrong. Because, I mean, I found working with hospice people, what they want to do is to erase the chalkboard. They want those things that they have thought about and worried about and felt guilty about or wanted to do but never did. They'd like to accomplish that so that they can die with a clear conscience. So I think that helps to create the kind of a climate where you can engage with forgiveness. Thanks.
Eric, I saw you had a question in the chat. Did you want to ask that?
Sure. Yeah, Robert and Roy, I appreciate your reflections. I was just noticing as I listened, the observation that the power of forgiveness has to repair, to release, to unburden, to set free those who have been wounded. And sometimes that happens even when the one who is offended or wounded may not be contrite. Or I think of cases where I walked with people in my work and end of life care, who are needing to work on forgiveness and practicing forgiveness with people who are no longer living and not even available to be in that relational engagement with. And so I guess my question that emerges for me, I've seen the power of this on that individual relational level. Right now, as I am a citizen of this world, I continue to really wonder what is the power of forgiveness on the communal or collective level? Like, can you say, you alluded to that a bit in your sharing, especially Robert. Is there more you might say about what shape this can take when the wounding is collective and communal?
I think what we have to do is start small and let it grow from there. And so we actually have, Roy and I and our colleagues, we've developed something called a 10-point plan of forgiveness for peace. And it starts in the individual human heart, where we encourage people to forgive people from the past who've hurt them, bring it into the family, cultivate it in the family, then cultivate it with other families within that community who've been doing the same thing. So you're beginning to develop a small community of forgiving families. And once you do that, you can expand it a little bit more to the community in terms of workplaces and worship places and different entities within the community, not between communities, but within. And once that community becomes strong, and if the other community that is in conflict also becomes strong, then, and only then, that could take years. It could take 2 to 3 years. Then they could come together and ask the question, how can we have a qualitatively different paradigm for peace now, other than either arguing with one another or literally fighting with one another with sticks and stones and bombs, but with the forgiveness already cultivated in the individual human heart, within the smaller family, larger family context, larger community, it would be easier to bring them together community to community. As Roy alluded to the Amish, they have a forgiving community established. There aren't people dropping bombs on them, but if there were, and we could get that community to engage for a few years on that, then they could come together. And I think it would make a shift in what is expected and what the outcomes are in the peace movement. Because when I look at I'm an egghead professor, remember, and when I look at all of the writings I can ever get my hands on with regard to the peace movement, I have literally never seen ever an approach that says we should bring two different communities together that have been at war with one another to cultivate forgiveness once it's in the human heart. It's never been tried in the history of the world. Do you think it's time? I think several thousand years past time. Why has this been such that nobody has the eyes to see? I literally don't get it. But we're ready to go. And it's very difficult because when we approach granting agencies, they yawn at us because they don't see it as worthwhile. And I don't understand that. But we're going to keep, as we say, fighting for it, if you can use that kind of word when we're talking about forgiveness.
Hi, this is Roy. I think part of the problem is that all too often we deal with stereotypes of others rather than reality. And that's really was at the heart of what I was talking about, the difference between hearing and listening. And Bob knows about R.D. Laing, who talked about something called the spiral of reciprocal perceptions. What he meant was, I think that you think, I think that you think that I think, and guess where things go, right? So I think what we have to do is to pay attention to each other. And let me give you an example. The IFI has been in Belfast in Northern Ireland for what, 25 years now, Bob?
It's, let's see, 22 years.
Okay. And what are brought together are youngsters, Protestant and Catholic. and they get to know each other. No longer is it a stereotype. This is reality. And suddenly, well, I mean, that's Bob, that's my friend. Just because that changes the climate. And it's the same, that's what we're trying to inculcate. I mean, clearly Zen Peacemakers is trying to change the climate. And we applaud that. And we want to be partners with you in doing that.
And with that in mind, I would now like to give a demonstration, if you want to go on this journey with me, of the process of forgiving, right? In other words, I'd like to walk us through briefly a forgiveness exercise in which each of us, that would include me, thinks about one person who has hurt you, right? And you can just listen and learn, or you can actively go on this journey with me. And if you want to go on the journey, I'd like you now to think about someone who's hurt you, whether in childhood, adolescence, in adulthood, or even yesterday, where you still have some of that discontent in your heart, right? And I'd like you to quiet a bit and kind of center on your inner world as I walk you through what we call the process model of forgiveness. And this process model, as Roy had said, has been used widely. We worked with those cardiac patients, and it literally widened the arteries of their heart when they thought about the injustice. Statistically significantly more blood flow through the heart. We've worked with fibromyalgia patients where their fibromyalgia symptoms go down and they improve. We've worked with drug rehabilitation people where their craving for the drugs to mask their pain has gone down. We've worked with acid burn victims in Pakistan. Can you imagine forgiving someone for that? Well, they did relative to a control group that didn't have forgiving, right? We've worked with 8th graders in Iran, where they have 4 different communities that do not get along very well. And we reduced prejudice and increased forgiveness in their heart. And we recently worked with men in a maximum security correctional institution. And we interviewed over 100 men. Guess what percentage of those men had serious injustices against them in their past that would make you weep if I shared them? What percentage of the 100? Right, 90%. So think about that. 90% of these men, and 40% of them never told anyone about it. And they were all clinically angry, anxious, and depressed. They went through this process model I'm about to share with you now, and they went to normal levels of anger, anxiety, and depression that were still with them in a normal way 6 months after the forgiveness therapy stopped. And the control group had the hand-picked Department of Corrections mental health program. After 6 months, they were still clinically angry, anxious, and depressed. And when I met with these gentlemen, they said, this program, handpicked, did nothing for us. And they didn't even know the results. And that's what they were telling us, and that was the findings. They went through the forgiveness program, voila. They went to normal levels of anger, anxiety, and depression. See, even those who are behind bars, and when you visit them in maximum security, you go through some bars and go through some more bars. It's very highly captured there, okay? And we rarely ask what kind of woundedness needs to be healed in maximum security so that they can stop perpetrating their effects of the injustice against them onto others. We worked with one gentleman here who was convicted of 30 murders, suspected of 100. You can't tell me all 100 deserve to die because they were mean to him. They were displacing their own effects from their own injustice and creating mayhem. And here's the process that they went through, and the people in drug rehab went through, and the people in hospice went through, and all of the acid burn victims went through. And you now can go through it and then bring it to the different corners of the world where you work to see if we can inject forgiveness into the peace movement, which is long overdue. There are 4 phases to our process model of forgiveness. And this occurs after they have examined one person, decided on one person, and freely chosen a pathway of forgiving. And the 4 phases are called the uncovering phase, the decision phase, the work phase, and the discovery phase. And I'm not expecting you to go through the forgiveness process perfectly in 20 minutes and have it all wrapped up, because sometimes it takes a year. Suzanne Friedman worked with incest survivors one-on-one for an hour a week until each one, 6 of them, said they forgave. Most of them didn't stop and say, now I have forgiven, until 1 year, okay? And most of the time, it takes at least 12 weeks for people to go through an effective forgiveness program. So think of what we're going to go through now as a brief introduction that you might turn to again, because we have books that work people through that are used in therapy. And so for the first phase, the uncovering phase, you've already chosen a person who's hurt you, and we ask these kind of questions. How's your heart, your inner world, when you think about this person? Are you angry or sad or discouraged? On a 1 to 10 scale, okay, label your degree of dissatisfaction, your degree of anger, your degree of sadness. How about fatigue? We find fatigue to be a very common physical symptom when people are carrying around injustices in their heart, because it takes a lot to be carrying around a big sack of injustices in your back every single day. Fatigue is very common. How about comparing yourself with the one who offended you? Does that ever pop into your mind? I talked with one college student whose father used to beat him when he was a child every night. Now that he's out of the home, he had a dream of his father chasing him. He knew what he would dream about when he went to bed every night. You see, he wasn't with his father, but his father was still in his heart. He was still comparing himself to his father. And then a big one that takes time is, what about your worldview, your philosophy of life? Has it become more negative, more tainted, more disrupted, more mistrusting? That happens a lot, where, again, I mentioned it earlier, people might be hurt in a couple's relationship. And now, once they're out of it, they say, no one can be trusted, ever. I'm never, ever getting that close to anyone ever again. See, their worldview has been changed as a result of an injustice, and now that's an effect in the human heart. So we look at these kind of discontents, and the light bulb goes on. With the maximum security men, one guy told me he was so angry at the way he was treated in childhood, including physical and sexual abuse, that he wanted to kill. And he still had that in maximum security. And when he saw the connection between what happened to him in the past and all this welling up of rage and hatred, the light bulb went on. And he said, hey, I've got to do something about this. And then we entered with him and others the decision phase. Do you want to walk a path of forgiveness? By the way, at this point, many people will say no. The incest survivors with whom Suzanne Friedman worked, all of them at the beginning said, they were very kind to her. They said, I'll enter your program, but I'll never forgive my father or my father figure for what he did to me. I'll ruin your study. Do you still want me? And in her kindness, Suzanne said yes. Okay. So when they come in willingly through their own free will in the decision phase, we examine what forgiveness is and what it's not, and give the person time to let forgiveness settle into the heart. they might need some time out at this point to think about it. And when they realize they're not reconciling necessarily, they might, but they won't necessarily automatically. They're not going to abandon justice. And what happened to them was wrong, is wrong, and will always be wrong. A lot of times people say yes. And you know what their primary motivator is? Their inner pain. They're tired of it. They're sick of it. They've been carrying it around, trying everything under the sun, and it hasn't worked. And so they say, okay, I think I want to try something. And this is what they try: forgiveness. They try it reluctantly, but they try it as like a last straw. Because we share some of the science with them and say, you know, this might be able to set you free. Then we do the work phase. And when we do the work phase, I talk about what I call hitting the forgiveness gym to become forgivingly fit. And in the forgiveness gym, we start with thinking exercises. In other words, we don't start with feelings. We don't start with the human heart, because that's already disrupted. And we're not as in control of our feelings as we are in our thinking. For example, if I say to you, right now I want you to picture an orange elephant sitting on top of an orange tree. Everybody think about that. So you can do that because you're in charge of your thinking. But if I now say, feel soft-hearted feelings toward a person who's brutalized you, it's not going to come usually this early, okay? When we've just hit the forgiveness gym and we're starting to become forgivingly fit. Our emotions take time. The thinking leads the emotions, and the emotions eventually start developing as what the philosopher Joanna North in 1987 called the softened heart. But with regard to the thinking, we bring people through 3 kinds of forgiveness exercises, and this can take months, right? The first one is called the personal perspective. The second one is called the global perspective. And the third one is called the cosmic perspective. And we don't always go to the cosmic perspective, as you'll see in a moment, but we always go to the personal and global perspectives. And then it depends on the person's worldview whether we go to the cosmic perspective, okay? So we're on thinking exercises in our second phase, the work phase. And let's go to the first perspective, the personal perspective. What we try to do is widen the lens with which you view the one who hurt you. Because many times we narrow that lens and we define the person by the nastiness. We define the person by the hurts. And what we try to do in widening the lens is see the person and this person's own woundedness from others in the past. So we ask questions such as this. Well, what do you think life was like for the one who hurt you as a child? You know, most people can answer that question because sadly, when we pick people to walk the path of forgiveness, it's usually someone we know well. It's oftentimes a family member, because those are the ones who shouldn't be hurting us. That's why it hurts so deeply. And if it's a stranger who's robbed you in Central Park in New York, well, maybe we can't do the personal perspective. But the vast majority of people can, because sadly, we're usually hurt by those closest to us. That's where the deep cuts to the heart are and remain. So probably most of you here today picked someone out you already know. And you can actually think about this question. What do you think some of the woundedness is that this person has been carrying that now has infected you. Describe that hurt as a child. Well, what about in adolescence? Was the person bullied at all, or confused, or had romantic breakups, or was cut from the team? Where were the stumbling blocks for this person that the person built up some negative energy, built up some woundedness in the heart that has actually become part of a pattern for the person, perhaps part of the person's very identity? And what happened to this person in adulthood where that person's worldview got tainted? That person has fatigue. That person may have anger. Tell a story about the person. Write it down in a journal. Who is this person well beyond the hurts given to you? And that takes time to reflect. And a lot of times we do journal writing when we engage in forgiveness interventions, so you can look back and add to it. Where you're seeing a vulnerable person, a wounded person, perhaps a confused person, perhaps someone who was injected with a resentment that was completely undeserved. Right? That is not excusing what the other did to you. We have to go back to the definition. We don't want you to say, oh, it's okay. The person is being nasty to me verbally with these constant putting downs. I understand because this person was put down by one of his parents growing up. Okay, it's okay, done. No, what the person did to you shouldn't have been done, because just because the person was wounded doesn't mean that gives the person the right to express that woundedness in that particular way. The person could have expressed the woundedness by going on a good jogging program or weightlifting at Planet Fitness, okay, or talking to a therapist, but instead ended up wounding you, and that's not okay. But we are understanding a vulnerable person that we might have not seen in this way ever. And so we're expanding our view in terms of a heart by the other that is not healed. Just like the gentleman with whom I worked who killed 30 people. They didn't deserve it. And he should be behind bars. And we're not excusing him, but he was gravely wounded in his childhood. And that shouldn't have happened. Right? So that's the personal perspective. Eventually, we go to the global perspective, where we ask this question: do you and this other person actually share a common humanity? For example, do you both have unique DNA? Did you know there was never, ever a person just like you? I'm talking to you personally, you Zen peacemakers today, not about the one who hurt you. I'm talking about you. Did you ever come to think about it with so many people in the world? There has never been a human being like you ever on this planet, ever, and there never will be again. Even if they're identical twins and they have the same DNA, they've had different life experiences, which makes them completely unique. You are completely different from everybody, which makes you, did you ever think about this before? Special, unique, and irreplaceable. You are special, unique, and irreplaceable. I want to pat you on the back for that. Pretty cool. Okay. Drum roll, please. If this is true, if I'm talking the truth, is the person who hurt you unique and special and irreplaceable in this world? You share that with the person who hurt you. Because you are special, unique, and irreplaceable, you have what we call built-in worth as a person. We use the term inherent worth. We even use that adjective, inherent, with 6-year-olds in Belfast, and they get it. Right? When we use stories like Horton Hears a Who, a person's a person no matter how small, they eventually get the idea of inherent worth in the story. They can apply it to themselves, and eventually, when they're ready, we ask them to apply it to the kid on the playground who pushed them down the other day. So I'm asking that now of you. If you're special, unique, and irreplaceable, if the one who hurt you is special, unique, and irreplaceable, if you have inherent worth, is it possible that the one who hurt you has inherent worth or value that cannot be taken away even because of what the person did to you? Let's continue looking at common humanity. You both need adequate nutrition to be healthy. You both need adequate rest. You're both going to die one day, both of you. You share a common humanity. You share a common uniqueness. You share a common worth. Couldn't we acknowledge that with regard to the other? Well, one of you had said, what if the person's deceased? How can I do that? Well, you can acknowledge the humanity of the other person to others. You see, you can talk about that person in a kind way to at least one other person when you're ready. You see, you can even forgive the deceased and be unburdened from a heart that is really dissatisfied and discontented because of what a person did and can never take it back, not in this world. Right? But let that settle into you, that that person is wounded and dumped the truck on you, probably. You share a woundedness now. That person wounded you and someone else wounded that other person. You share a common humanity. You share that with one another. And try to acknowledge that. And the cosmic perspective, we do that, it's a transcendent perspective, where we do it only if a person has a belief in a divine being. And we ask, for example, if you're working with a Jewish person, you might say, you know, if you turn to Genesis, which is the first book in the Bible, we mentioned that with Joseph, and you go to the very first chapter, it must be important, that first chapter, to begin the first chapter. Did you know there's something in there that's actually repeated in there? And the Bible rarely repeats, okay? And in the very first book of the Hebrew Bible, there's a repetition of an idea. And the idea is this: we are all made in the image and likeness of God. And so we ask people in forgiveness therapy, are you made in the image and likeness of God? And the answer is, well, I guess so, if we're dealing with someone who accepts Genesis 1 as part of their belief system. Drum roll, please, again. Once the person accepts that, we ask, is the one who hurt you made in the image and likeness of God? And I sometimes get this, oh boy, I wish I didn't know that, because they're not quite ready for it. Okay, take your time. Let's not rush forgiveness, but let's, when you're ready, think about that. And when you put the three together, a wounded person wounded you, you both have inherent worth, you both share a common humanity of being special, unique, and irreplaceable. And if you go to the cosmic perspective, you're both made in the image and likeness of God, and you reflect on that in your journal with the question, who is this person? We start to see the heart softening in compassion, where you actually begin to reduce the anger, where you have a certain sadness toward the other, a certain willingness to reach out to the other, a certain willingness to help the person climb out of the pit that the person is making for the self. This person, in throwing others into the pit, keeps throwing the self into a pit. Let's help that person out of that pit. And when we are becoming more forgivingly fit, we then ask the people to stand in the pain. What does that mean? When you're feeling annoyed, don't throw the pain back to the one who hurt you or to anyone else who could become your innocent victim. If you bear the pain, that's heroic because you're not then throwing all your pain back to others. Do you realize your own innocent family members could inherit your pain and pass it on to their children's 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 children? When you deliberately decide to stand in the pain, that's heroic. And people say, well, if I stand with the pain, then you're asking me to stay with this big sack of woes on my back for the rest of my life, Enright. No. Here's the paradox of forgiving that we see over and over again. When you heroically stand in the pain for others, for the one who hurts you and others who could be the victims of your pain, as you do that for others, the pain begins to leave. That's when the irritability starts dripping away. That's when the anxiety can start going down. And then the person's strong enough for the final point of the work phase. We ask the person to exercise the moral virtue nature of forgiveness. Can you give a gift to the one who hurt you? Ay, 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 people might say. But see, by now they've walked a pathway where that doesn't sound so bad anymore because they've stood in the pain, which itself is a gift. They see the inherent worth of the other and they see the woundedness in the other. Can you give a gift to the other? Well, if I give a gift to the other, it might be a signal that I want to restart the relationship and I don't want to do that. Okay, how about donating some money to charity in the person's name and not even let the person know? You're still doing something for the other person, or a kind word about the person to another. An incest survivor who happened to be Jewish took her own children to her father's grave. He was deceased, and she had a tasteful religious ceremony of respect for the dead, for the father, giving him a gift posthumously and giving grandpa back to the children. See, you really can forgive those who are deceased, okay? You can be set free. You can be set free if someone's abandoned you and you don't know whether they're in Arkansas or in Madagascar. You can still forgive them by going through the cognitive issues of personal, global, and cosmic perspectives, going through letting the compassion grow in your heart, bearing the pain for them, and eventually giving a gift of some kind. And this can take months. And then we hit the discovery phase. And the discovery phase basically is learning from this pathway, learning through suffering. People realize that their suffering is not for nothing. They realize they become more sensitive to other suffering. And we were surprised, many of the incest survivors in Suzanne Friedman's study didn't want to become therapists, but they said, I want to become an advocate to help other incest survivors heal. They developed a new meaning in life that developed into a new purpose in life, which is to aid others to get out of that pit, because she found the pathway of healing. One gentleman who was in for life in prison said to me, I'm never getting out of here, but I have a new purpose in life. I'm going to help my cellmates learn to forgive. I'm going to help them get rid of the effects of the injustices against them so they can be more peaceful in the cells. And at the end of the discovery phase, we find, and this is where we do our research, where we give forgiveness scales and anger, anxiety, depression scales, we find that as you offer this kind of mercy to someone who doesn't necessarily deserve it, statistically significantly, we find people have movement in that they learn to forgive more deeply than they did before the forgiveness intervention, and their emotional well-being becomes healthier. There's more hope for the future. They end up liking themselves even better, because one sad thing about being beaten down by others, we tend to believe the lie. And when we believe the lie, we don't like ourselves. When we see that we have inherent worth as well as the other, we like ourselves and we release ourselves from the emotional prison. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the forgiveness pathway, what we call the process model of forgiveness. And I'd like to stop here and give it over to Roy again so we can begin hearing from you as well.
Thank you. I think this is a really profound topic. And I'll tell you, I like the idea of what Bob was mentioning, that each of us is an original. I like the image of Carl Sagan, who says we're all made of stardust, which is a pretty wonderful thought, isn't it? I'd also like to mention one other thing, that it's guilt. Because I think sometimes we can feel guilty for the problems that we've endured. And here's a specific reason I'm mentioning this. I work with a group at the local hospital called Wellness for Warriors. These are EMS first responders, police, firefighters, military active or retired, all of them dealing in some way with PTSD from their circumstances. And they can't forgive themselves for the circumstances that they've encountered. They couldn't save that person, or they couldn't whatever. And when we say that forgiveness is, first of all, a gift that you give to yourself, we really mean that. Because if you can feel it, then you can share it. So when we see who would like to jump in and say something.
Looks like we have a hand up here.
Hello, thank you so much for sharing everything that you've experienced and know. For me, it keeps on being a conflict, what you mentioned, like what is forgiveness not? It's, yeah, I didn't go through the process so intimately, and I would love to experience the process, but to not be confused that condoning the act that someone has done or repeatedly has done, that still keeps on being confusing, that I could forgive without saying it's okay what you have done. That keeps on being like a confusing thing in my mind. I get locked in there. It doesn't release itself anywhere there.
I think what you're saying is an excellent demonstration of why we don't jump into the work phase right away. You see, people need time to think about and relearn in a lot of ways what forgiveness is, because we haven't taken that time in schools, in workplaces, to actually get people deeply schooled into what forgiveness is. And it does take time to separate, because when you forgive, you're literally separating the person and the action. You are not defining the person by the action, you're defining the person by other issues that are more important, actually, to you and to the other than that action against you. So as we separate the person and the action continues to be wrong no matter what, but the person is seen in a much richer, broader, deeper way, you see. And until that settles in, you don't want to start down the pathway of forgiveness. I would say wait and do some thinking about this and some journaling on it, and realize the goal is to separate the action and the person. And when you can see the action and define it as wrong and say, I still might be able to reach out in mercy toward the other without harming myself, then open the forgiveness gym door. Then go on the forgiveness exercise machines. But before that, take your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for that really important insight.
I hope there are others who are courageous enough to say something.
Carolyn?
Hi, thank you so much for this. It's interesting to see how I get along in this process a bit and kind of am onto one step a little bit and then kind of backtrack into the other parts. I like seeing about this process. I want to ask about a specific situation where I've been happily married for 27 years, but I was very unhappily married before that to someone who was abusive. And fortunately, I got out of that, and that man is dying. And I am sad. He has ALS. I'm sad about that. And I'd like to reach out to him. But every time I've thought about writing to him, all of my resentment is so big. And I can see that this is going to be a good process for me. But there's probably, I don't know if there's time for me to work through the whole process before I could reach out to him. So I still would like to tell him I am sad for his situation now, but I'm not quite sure how to do that. And if it's okay to say, I still resent what happened. So that's where I am.
I'm sorry for the pain that you certainly did not deserve. Here's one thing I would recommend. I would recommend writing a letter that you do not send first. Write a letter out with the intent not to send it. Right? Look at it, make it a draft, refine it, let it sit there, right? And let it work in your heart. And see if eventually, as that sits there and as you work on it, you might want to transfer that to him. And if you don't, as Roy talked about guilt, you need not feel guilty because he has left you with a challenge, and you could always work on forgiving him again after he passes, as we've discussed here today. So it's not that you have the pressure that you must wrap all of this up before it is his time. I want you to hear that, so you're not feeling the pressure as well as the sadness. But if you do the homework assignment of a letter that is not sent, and you let that work in your heart, you never know where that might lead you. And you could say, as you give the letter, as with as much forgiveness in your heart as you can, that you still have resentment. The way you say that, the quality of your words will be gentler than if you say it with a revenge-filled heart. You can use the same words, but they will come out differently if you approach him face to face with the forgiving heart. So feel free to say that. And, maybe it would help him to apologize now to wrap things up, because we have found in the hospice situation, their ability to forgive quickly is much better than anyone else we've ever seen, because they knew they didn't have a lot of time. So that's what I would recommend, but I would just want to repeat, don't feel guilty if you cannot do that, because the process does not demand that you reach the finish line at a particular time. You can continue afterwards, but if you want to do it beforehand after writing a letter you don't send, that's up to you. It's your choice. That's what I like about forgiveness. It's your choice. I have a book called Forgiveness is a Choice. I did that deliberately so people don't think it's a grim demand. It shouldn't be that. We should be drawn to it, not beaten into it.
Is there someone else?
Looks like we have Dale.
Sarah, I see Sarah's hand up.
Hi, I'm happy to share, but I think Dale was before me and then David.
Oh,
I'll be as quick as I can be. I want to, first of all, thank you two greatly for all the work you have done on forgiveness. And fortuitously, I'm facilitating a 3-day forgiveness retreat starting this Friday. And you have helped me. And then I want a quick quote. There's a teacher named Patricia Sun who said, "Love is forgiving. Love is forgiving. Love is for giving." And I think that's the process that, in a nutshell, that you guys teach. It's beautiful. And I have one quick question. In my experience, what keeps us from forgiving, what keeps the wall around our heart, is that we don't want to feel the pain that got stuck inside there. And so it's not, in my experience, it's necessary for a true forgiving to go through the pain and come out the other side. I don't know if you agree with that, but I'm curious.
I 100% agree. Sigmund Freud discovered the psychological defenses. And one of them, which is a big one, is denial. And denial is, it's in us, and we subconsciously push it away because it's too painful. But you know the big problem with that? Pushing it away doesn't cure it. It's still there. And so denial still keeps us in emotional prison. And when people realize that and realize there's a safety net called forgiveness, they can break the denial. Many people stay in denial because they're afraid when they make the subconscious conscious, which is another Freudian idea, when you're now making where you're aware of that, there's nowhere to go. You look at all the pain and there's nowhere to heal that. But if you realize you have a healing approach, once it becomes conscious and you're looking at all that pain, you're more likely to allow yourself to break the denial. Because if you just simply live with the denial, you're still living with pain, whether you see it consciously or not, it's gnawing at you. And so let's get rid of it. Let people know there's a safety net for that pain, and they're more likely to break denial willingly and confidently hit the forgiveness gym. And congratulations on your 3 days of forgiveness. I hope it goes great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, this is Roy. Same thing that I wanted to say. I just wanted to mention that in graduate school, one of my a psychology professor said, he was a Carl Rogers person. He said, if we get rid of the symptom, we've gotten rid of the problem. And I raised my hand. I said, what about grief? If you don't see it, it doesn't exist. And if we don't see the people are in pain, but we don't always know that the pain is visible.
I think David has a comment or question.
Robert and Roy, for me, I know what you've been talking about is very accurate, because inside quietly my heart is weeping. But it's not all sadness. It's a recognition of, and I'm awkward in using this word, but it's like I grew up in a world that, from my perspective, rewarded not forgiving, that rewards the almost more so rewards the conflict, the destruction, the violence, the anger. And I kept, early on in this hour and a half, I kept asking, so using that word reward, what are the rewards here? How can we be more clearly offering and defining some really tangible rewards that makes this process more inviting. And now that we've sort of finished the hour and a half, you've sort of answered that question because I can feel it in my heart. And it's just yes, big yes to both of you that boy, we sure need this work.
Yeah, and we also need to point out the rewards. When I started this in a university setting in 1985, people thought I had lost my mind because there literally had never been a scientifically based study gathering data of people forgiving one another. There had been studies on apology, but never on forgiving where we actually collected data. And it got so bad, one student came into my office one day and said, well, one professor told me not to work with you anymore because you've ruined your career and you're going to ruin me. I'm never going to get a job in academia. Is that true? And it was so new, I said, I don't know. It's possible. She stuck it out. Now she's a tenured professor. That's my revenge. But here is what was good about the science. Now that we have 30 years of science behind us, the science shows the reward in showing the outcomes, such as a healthier heart, fewer fibromyalgia symptoms, greater hope for the future, liking yourself. The men in maximum security prison who were probably living for years with clinical levels of anger, anxiety, and depression going to normal levels, and it continued for the 6 months when we reassessed them. We want to shout out the science as the reward. And that would again help people break the denial that we talked about a minute ago with Dale, where they say, there really is a reward waiting for me, and maybe even waiting for the one I'm forgiving, giving the other a chance to reconcile with me, which is a profound gift, if you think about it. Getting back together with the one I've abused, wow, wow, wow. And so that doesn't always happen, but that's another possibility. And if we keep extending the rewards larger and larger, eventually group to group forgiving can be the reward of established peace. Because I talked with a United Nations expert years ago who said, we have found in the United Nations that war is cyclical, about every 10 years. Okay? Maybe we finally have a way to stop the cycle, the 10-year cycle of wars, as we have found a way to stop the incessant angers, anxieties, and depressions. We need the science to show that in the peace movement. Well, we've shown the science for the human heart. Let's shout it from the rooftops. Yeah. And a lot of people who really thought I was crazy when I started this, not all of them, but at least some of them came around where they accepted me as a person and as a scientist because of the science.
Can I just also say that I think we need to trust ourselves because we have within us all that we need to succeed.
Yep. And again, we, in our own time, in our own way, let us be drawn to this, not pressured into it. Sarah, your turn.
So we are at time, so let's just we have time for Sarah, and then we can do some concluding comments.
Thank you very much for taking my question and for putting this event on. It's been very revelatory, and I love the part where you say forgiveness is not the same thing as what did you say? What was the word?
Reconciliation.
Reconciliation. I love that. For me, that just lifted a huge burden.
Yep.
As a stepmother of a woman who's now 42, and I've been her stepmother for 20 something years, I think I did it backwards. I feel like I've had a huge amount of empathy for any woundedness she's had and, really given myself to her, but she is so damaged and so aggressive with me. And we got to the point where she started screaming at me in my own house, and I lose sleep over it, and I'm afraid to move toward her. It's just too painful.
You don't have to, because forgiveness allows you to work quietly with your own heart when you are ready. And it does strengthen you when you bear the pain and some of this inner toxicity starts to melt away. You may be ready in the future, and it may take time, but a forgiving heart may open that door. And you know what? Your working on forgiving her might introduce the idea of her need to forgive a lot of people who dumped the truck on her, and that's why she's yelling at you. See,
Yeah,
you,
she's a therapist, so
oh,
I don't,
well,
but
well, see, if she hasn't gone into the realm of forgiving, she might not see the absolute necessity of doing that in her own life. And it seems to me that she has been gravely wounded by others and she's taking it out on you. She needs to forgive and also ask for forgiveness from you. And as Roy mentioned earlier, engage in self-forgiveness because she's offended herself in how she's treated you. She needs self-forgiveness.
it's very difficult during family gatherings. There aren't any anymore because it's so unbelievably toxic. So anyway, it's very painful for someone who's committed to peace, that's for sure. But I've written all the notes down, and hopefully you have a handout or a book that I can get to continue.
Yeah. I have 3 self-help books. Let me just mention them briefly.
Okay.
One is called Forgiveness is a Choice, published by the American Psychological Association. Another is called The Forgiving Life. If you hear that, The Forgiving Life is more about living forgiveness in a day-to-day way after you've learned to forgive 1 or 2 or 3 people. And it's a dialogue between 2 women. It's a Socratic dialogue, also published by the APA. And another one called 8 Key with the numeral 8 Keys to Forgiveness, published by Norton in New York. And that's the one we use in the Maximum Security Correctional Institution.
And Bob will give you the email address for us.
Oh, let's see, the email, you can get those through Amazon.com actually. And then
For International Forgiveness Institute.
oh yeah, the International Forgiveness Institute, well, you can go to the website. There's a lot of information on our International Forgiveness Institute, and it's called internationalforgiveness.com. Internationalforgiveness.com.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Robert and Roy. Yeah, that was going to be my final question to you is where do we go from here with this amazing information? It sounds like a good place to start is your website. So I'll go ahead and send that information out in the post-event email, and I'll leave it to you both to make any concluding comments.
Well, I would like to say thank you, Zen Peacemakers, because your work is essential. And thank you for this opportunity. I think our hearts are beating in the same rhythm. And we're trying to help people to embrace a healthier and happier life.
I too want to thank you for what you do. We're trying so hard to get into the peace movement and group to group. You may be able to pioneer that before we do, because you're already set up as peace workers. And I'd like to just leave you with one final thought. It's called legacy. A lot of times when we talk about legacy, we think about leaving the rocking chair, money in the bank to others. But I'm talking about your legacy of either giving your discontent and your anger and your difficulties to the next generation, or giving a settledness of peace and more love, more understanding, more compassion to that next generation. Because they are going to inherit what you give them. What will your legacy be at the end of your life? Giving an inheritance of anger and discontent, or giving a legacy of love to your family members? Do you realize that your love actually can exist in other people's hearts long after you're gone? Where your children's children may still have some of that love you have given away that transfers from generation to generation? Your love can exist long after you are gone. And I want you to think about that. What will your legacy be?